Okay. Let me press F5. Can you see the whole screen presentation now? Okay, can you see the whole screen now?
Yeah, it's so clear.
Okay, well done. Okay, so today, as every month, the Research Centre of Applied Linguistics is organised. Monthly seminars are organised by the teachers of the English language teaching, English language and literature, and the translation and interpretation departments. And every month, starting with me, Associate Professor Dr. Hanife Benson, we are going to have a seminar. And my seminar will be based on errors and corrective feedback. First of all, we need to differentiate between the terms errors and mistakes. Now, in our daily lives, we say, whoops, I've made a mistake. So this shows us that we are actually aware that we have made a mistake. So if we are able to self-correct ourselves, then this terminology is called mistake. Now, we use the terms errors and mistakes interchangeably. However, they are actually very different in the English as a foreign language context. Now, as I said, mistakes, they can be self-corrected, and errors, they cannot be self-corrected unless they are advanced level students. So C1, C2 in the new proficiency level. So this shows us that errors are much more important than mistakes. Errors reflect gaps in a learner's knowledge. They occur because the learner does not know what is correct. So in our English as a foreign language classrooms, if our students do not know that what the correct version is, then we say that this is an error. Okay, this is the first criterion to differentiate between errors and mistakes. The second criterion is consistency. So, for example, if learners consistently use a deviant form for a correct target language form, an error has occurred. But if the deviant forms are random, then we call them mistakes. Now, a third criterion that I have found was the frequency of occurrence. Now, that is, errors which have a rather low frequency are considered to be mistakes, and those that have a high frequency, so that occur a lot, they are called errors. And so, in other words, errors are systematic and mistakes are haphazard. So they just pop up now and again. In addition to this, we can say that errors are considered to be rule governed since they follow the rules of the learner's interlanguage. Now, what do we mean by that? It means it follows the grammar of the learners, the students, interlanguage, which allows the use of such structure at the particular stage of the second language development. So, as you can see, there are many criterions that differentiate errors and mistakes. However, the frequency or self-correctability alone as the criterion for differentiating between errors and mistakes. So you need to consider all of these to be able to say that a student has made an error. Now, apart from this, we apart from in our language learning, before the emergence of error analysis, errors were perceived as academic sins that needed to be eradicated in the language learning classroom. And students that committed errors were actually perceived by teachers as either half-witted or lazy. Now, with the emergence of error analysis, the importance of errors came to fore. So our question that we are dealing with draws the question, why are errors significant? Now, errors are firstly significant for the student, for the teachers, because they show us, they indicate and they detect what the learner has flaws in. For example, if we say that the student makes a mistake as, I goed to school yesterday, and adds ed to the verb go to indicate that it's the past tense, we can say that here the student has actually learned that the past tense form is ed. However, the student hasn't yet learned that go is an irregular verb. So this shows us teachers that this student has learned that the ed form that represents the past tense, but hasn't yet learned the irregular forms. So this is why it's important for the teacher. Second, they provide to the researcher evidence of how language is learned or acquired and what strategies or procedures the learner is employing in his discovery of the language. So as a researcher, it shows us where and what the student knows and what strategies the student is employing to learn the foreign language. In addition to this, for the learner, they are indispensable to them, because we can regard the making of errors as a device the learner uses in order to learn. So it's a device for them to learn, and it is a way the learner has for testing his hypothesis about the nature of language, of learning a language. So the student themselves, they test themselves through errors. So errors in this sense is very important, and we should consider them important in the process of learning a second language as well. Now, in the past, errors were perceived as now in the Turkish Cypriot context and the Turkish context in particular, the traditional methodologies also drew attention to learners' errors, and they say that, and when students used to make mistakes in these contexts, the students did not like to receive. Still, I can reflect into our methodologies now, the current innovative methodologies. So we need to cover corrected. When should students be corrected? Which errors should enjoy priority in error correction? How should students' errors be corrected, and who should correct students' errors? Now, if we take into consideration the first question, should students' errors be corrected? Again, we need to go back to the studies and the ones now. Errors were either seen, they were seen as academic sins, like I said. And because of this nature, students, they still have got this feeling that when they are corrected, they've committed a really big sin. But actually, the correcting of errors nowadays, it should be perceived in a different way. It's actually something positive that will improve our students. So students, if we on the one hand, it is desirable to tolerate many of the learner's errors, as this will have positive psychological consequences, since when teachers tolerate their students' errors, they feel more confident to use the target language, even with their limited linguistic resources. So on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, too much tolerance towards learners' errors may lead to fossilization. So what do we mean by fossilization? If we do not correct these errors, they will become fossilized, and when they become adults, those errors will still consist. Now, it is essential to provide the students with proper corrective feedback, while at the same time avoid excessive error correction. So we shouldn't be overdoing things. So if an error is not corrected, both the speaker and the rest of the class will consider it a right to be errors, but you shouldn't go overboard. Now, taking this into consideration, they want their errors to be corrected. The term corrective feedback doesn't just mean the correction of errors. We are talking about giving students positive, negative feedback with regard to the errors that they have committed. That we should cover when we're thinking about errors is, when should learners' errors be corrected? So when is the right time to correct these students' errors? Now, we have two productive skills. One is speaking and one is writing. The other two, listening and reading, they are our receptive skills. So students do not produce anything with regard to these skills. Taking into consideration the oral production of errors, when a teacher, an English as a foreign language teacher, is carrying out an accuracy-based activity, they should correct at the moment that error occurs. However, if it's a fluency-based activity, then this should be the errors should be corrected at the end of the class or in another session. Or maybe you can just call the student individually into your office and tell them that they've made such an error. Now, when it's with written errors, because it's in the written form, obviously you'll take more time. It will take more time for you to correct their errors, and we can either correct their errors, take notes of their errors, and take notes of the ones that are committed the most, and then go back to a session in the classroom and write these errors on the board and ask students, you can discuss and focus on these errors so that they are not committed again. Now, students should also be asked to examine their compositions or their essays to discover their own errors as well. Now, there are some especially when it comes to with spoken errors, the errors that hamper communication and distort intelligibility should be actually corrected at that moment, immediately, because there's no understanding, there's no communication breaks down. Now I'm moving on to the question to which errors should enjoy priority in error correction. Now, answering this question is isn't as straightforward as it seems, actually. Learners should not be corrected indiscriminately. And since no teacher has time to adequately deal with all the errors made by his or her students, a hierarchy should be established for the correction of errors according to their nature and pedagogical significance. So in such a hierarchy, priority should be given to errors which may hamper communication and distort intelligibility, such as errors in the wrong pronunciation of minimal pairs. For example, if they make an error with sheep and sheep and ship, then, or vice versa, you need to correct them straight away. Now, next in the hierarchy should be errors which cause listeners, whether native or non-native speakers of English, irritation and negative attitude towards the speaker. So if the one opposite perceives the speaker negatively, then that should follow the next hierarchy. Now, with regard to grammatical errors, a distinction should be made between global and local. In 2010, defined global as an error use of major elements of sentence structure, which makes a sentence or utterance difficult or impossible to understand. Look at the example, so not late for school. As you can see, we cannot understand anything from this sentence. So we call these global errors. In contrast to global error, there's local errors, and it's an error in the use of an element of sentence structure which does not cause problems of comprehension. So if we look at the example, if I heard from him, I will let you know. In the first example of the global errors, the whole sentence is normally marked as erroneous, whereas in the second sentence, only the word heard would be marked as erroneous. Okay, and so I've highlighted these. Therefore, errors that involve word order, missing subjects, or misuse of connectors are more important than an omitted article or an inflectional morpheme like plural s. So we should pay attention to this when we are correcting our errors. In addition to this, we have errors that are committed, pragmatic errors. Now, pragmatic errors should enjoy priority in corrective feedback, because if they are not corrected, and students actually, they want their pragmatic errors to be corrected, but that is if the teacher is aware of them as well, because most English as a foreign language teachers are not native, and pragmatic competence, to be pragmatically competent, it's native speakers are more pragmatically competent than non-native teachers, for example, and they have like a missing gap in terms of sarcasm, humor, and when these arise in the class, the teacher themselves need to know these to be able to identify if the student has made an error or not. A study in Katayama's study indicated that they preferred their pragmatic errors to be corrected on all the students. They wanted their pragmatic errors to be corrected on all occasions, in contrast to linguistic errors such as grammatical, phonological, lexical errors. So pragmatic errors were seen to be the most important for the learners in this study. Finally, a distinction needs to be made between persistent versus occasional errors. Obviously, the former should be given priority in error correction, since if they are not with what they to life, so it's possible to change. Now, another contradiction, another argument between who should correct the errors arises in our next slide. So who should correct the errors? We have actually 4 agents that can correct students' errors. The first is teacher, the second is peer, the third is collaborative, and the fourth is the students themselves. Now, teachers obviously are expected to provide corrective feedback, and because they are the one who is the source of knowledge, they are seen as the person who passes on the knowledge. So we always expect our teachers to correct us. Teacher correction plays a major role in the writing and language learning classes, says Martzban and Sajami in 2014. Another agent, the other agent that I was talking about, is peer. Now, peer corrective feedback is actually very beneficial in terms of the teacher as well, because peer correction takes the workload off the teacher. It takes over the instructional roles and responsibilities of the teacher, so the student, their peers, comment, correct, or criticize. Now, students are more involved in the language learning process rather than passively receiving the information. So as you can see, the shift from teacher-centeredness to student-centeredness actually passes through peer error correction and in these innovative language teaching methodologies. It's also a social activity where it enables students to collaborate and discuss their errors in the language learning classroom. The third agent that can correct students' errors is collaboratively. Now here we are talking about the teacher and the students in the classroom collaboratively sharing their knowledge all together. So there's joint intellectual efforts among students and between students and instructors, and there's mutual engagement of group members. So everybody is engaged in a collaborative environment dealing with errors all together. Like I said, so if we focus on, if the teacher focused on a fluency-based activity and took notes of the erroneous utterances and then discuss these in a later session, this is actually done collaboratively, and it's very effective as well, according to empirical studies. The fourth person, the agent that can correct the errors, is the student themselves. Now, the problem with self-correction is that low proficiency learners normally are not able to correct their errors when brought to their attention. In other words, self-correction is only suitable for advanced learners who have a linguistic resource to correct their own errors. Now, the correction of these errors has been perceived especially in the Turkish and Turkish Cypriot context, as something negative. And I can still see this influenced in our class, in our innovative methodologies now. Students perceive the term correction or corrective feedback as something they can lose face in the class, and that friendly atmosphere is directly broken because somebody corrects another person in the class. The first thing that we should underline and highlight here is that when we are teaching a foreign language, we need to focus on the importance of errors. We need to tell them that errors are important because they tell us where you are, what you need to learn, your flaws, the drawbacks, your weaknesses, and strengths. So you should make sure that students perceive corrective feedback positively, so then they will perceive their friends correcting them positively as well. because students in such context, they say that you are not the teacher, you shouldn't be correcting me, you don't know anything. But actually, we can learn from each other as well. Any questions up to now? Is it clear? Now, the fifth question that arises is, how should learner errors be corrected? Now, we have oral and written, and they are both distinguished from each other. Now, with oral errors, there are strategies have been proposed to deal with them. And the first strategy is recasts. So when a student, and now this is in an accuracy-based activity, not in a fluency-based activity, because you remember I said to you that we should immediately correct students' errors. Well, if we go back to this, then in accuracy-based activities, we can follow these strategies, we can implement these strategies into our classes to help students self-correct. However, you should bear in mind that we use it as a foreign language teachers, but we don't know the terms themselves. Like, we use these in our classes, we've been using these strategies in our class consciously, but we did not know what these terminologies mean. So the first way of correcting students' errors is called recast, and here the teacher implicitly reformulates or expands the student's ill-informed or incomplete utterance. Now, unlike prompts, which are more explicit, in this corrective feedback strategy, recasts are generally indirect and implicit in that they are introduced by phrases such as, use this word, you should say. So let's look at the example. The student says, I lost my road. And then the teacher says, oh, you mean you lost your way? And then what happens? So in such a structure, we try to make the student find their mistake. Now, according to Richards and Schmitz, recasts have the following characteristics. Now, one, they are a reformulation of the ill-formed utterance. Two, they expand the utterance in some way. Three, the central meaning of the utterance is retained. And four, the recast follows ill-formed. Now, that feedback strategy is called elicitation. Now, elicitation is a strategy which prompts the learner to correct his or her own error. So what we do basically in elicitation forms, for example. So we have the sentence, my father cleans the plate. Excuse me, he cleans the... And we leave a blank there for the third way of correcting students, of giving corrective feedback, the third strategy is pretend in the and the student says 14, and then the teacher says, excuse me, now this may be by the student saying 14 what, the teacher says. So the teacher is using clarification request here, saying 14 what, and then the student would say 14 for a week, and then the teacher would say, as a recast maybe, 14 times a week. And then the student will say, yes, lunch and dinner. So including lunch and dinner. The fourth corrective feedback strategy is where the teacher repeats or echoes the ill-formed part of the student's utterance, usually with a change in intonation to highlight the learner's. So what we do actually is something the student would say, he's in the bathroom, and you would say, bathroom? And then the student would say, oh, bedroom, he's in the bedroom. I'm sure that we've come across such examples in our language learning classrooms. The fifth type of corrective feedback, the fifth oral corrective feedback strategy is called metalinguistic feedback. And here, it provides comments, questions, or information related to the well-formedness of the student's utterance without explicitly providing the correct form. Metalinguistic comments generally indicate that there is an error somewhere in the learner's utterance. For example, there was a mistake. Can you find your error? Now let's look at the first type. I am here since January, and the teacher says, well, okay, but do you remember we talked about the present perfect tense? So the teacher is trying to draw attention to the tense that they had previously taught. The second example, we look at the people yesterday, the student says. And then the teacher says, well, what's the ending we put on the verbs when we talk about the past tense, for example? And then the student says ed. So we're trying to remind the students that when to be able to use the past tense, you add ed, so they should be adding ed to the verb, basically. Now, the sixth is explicit corrective feedback, and it refers to the explicit provision of the correct form. As the teacher provides the correct form, he or she clearly indicates to the student that he's made an incorrect utterance. So, for example, if the student says the dog ran fastly, and then the teacher says fastly, fastly doesn't exist. Fast does not take ly, and explicitly tells them that this is the mistake and why it is a mistake. Feedback 7, propose another technique for oral corrective feedback, and they suggest by mixing different types of feedback, we call multiple feedback. So if we mix all of these, it's called basically multiple feedback. There's whether we correcting students' errors, and some like the one in Zhang and Ma in 2010, the students, the participants, the teacher participants in their study preferred to employ explicit and metalinguistic strategies for correcting phonological errors, metalinguistic technique for grammatical errors. So the errors and all the students, so I suggest trying out all of them and seeing what attitude your students show, and then continue accordingly, because every class and every student is different. Now, we've spoken about strategies that we can employ for oral correction. Now we're going to move on to written error correction. Now, written errors can be corrected either directly or indirectly. Now, let's just say a student has an essay and they've made the mistake, I goed to school yesterday. If you erase the term goed and write went, then we call this direct written corrective feedback. However, if you underline it or use metalinguistic corrective feedback, like providing codes, we call this indirect corrective feedback. So research related to this shows that metalinguistic corrective feedback is actually much more preferred by the students and the teachers, and has had many more positive outcomes than direct corrective feedback. So this is preferred. But you need to bear in mind that when you are using metalinguistic corrective feedback, the codes, for example, I go, wrong form. This is a wrong form of a verb. It's indicating and it's telling students that they've made a wrong form of the verb, and that is why that word is incorrect. Now, obviously students need to be trained on what that means to be able to understand corrective feedback. The form of example with corrective feedback, it's obvious what the error is. So basically, with direct error, written error corrective feedback, we're giving it to our students on a silver plate. And with metalinguistic or indirect written corrective feedback, we are making students figure out what their and what the reason behind this is. Now, with errors, we have errors that are focused, and we talk about focused feedback. So which should be now this is whether the teacher attended correct or specific types of errors for correction, like for focus. So if we select specific types of errors to correct, we call this focused. And if we want to cover all of the errors, then we call this unfocused. So it's unfocused is more extensive. Corrective feedback may prove more effective as learners will be able to examine several corrections of a single error and thus obtain the rich evidence they need to both understand why what they wrote was brain and correct. So should all errors be corrected, or should we select a specific time? Now, research actually for the past that the focus written corrective feedback is much more beneficial, but recent studies have shown that unfocused is actually better. Again, I suggest, it's issue, I suggest that you, this depends on the students. So try that one out and try that one out, and then see which one is much more beneficial in your settings. Apart from oral corrective feedback and written corrective feedback, we have the term electronic feedback. Now, in electronic feedback, the teacher highlights an error and provides a hyperlink to a concordance file that provides example of correct usage. We use for students' errors, and we use the comment section to provide them feedback. So we give electronic corrective feedback on our computers. Another way of providing feedback to our students is with video feedback. Now, what we do with video feedback is we record ourselves giving explicit corrective feedback to our students, and then they watch the video and they correct themselves. Now, I'm not going to go in detail about this, but I think that we should address this before I close up. So why do students commit errors? We know that errors are important, and errors, they show us, they are indications of the student's learning process. We want our students to make errors, but why do people make errors? Now, we are seen to make mistakes in our mother tongue. But what about the errors that are committed in the language learning classes? Now, usually with second language, foreign language, they are called because of mother tongue interference. So our first language interferes to our second language, and this is why we make these errors. We transfer the grammatical rules, phonological, morphological, grammatical, lexical, and sociocultural elements of our first language to our second language, and this is why we commit errors. Proponents of contrastive analysis, for example, they highlighted this as a source of students' errors. However, this is not the only source why students make errors. Students, after the emergence of error analysis, it was observed that students, they do not only translate from their mother tongue to the target language and make these errors. It's also because of intralingual and developmental errors. Now, what are these? And they are caused by the mutual interference of items in the target language. And it's because they are wrong applications of learning strategies that the students have employed, or it's a faulty teaching techniques. So the teacher has incorrectly taught these students something, and these students are producing these erroneous utterances. Obviously, these two terms, they need to be dealt with in detail, but this is what the end of my seminar. Do you have any questions related to these? I've just briefed you all in on about what errors are and why they are important. I want you all to actually highlight these in your language learning classes when you are teaching, so students, they don't get offended when you are giving them corrective feedback. Make sure that they can understand that corrective feedback is something for their benefit. And this can be given by their peers or collaboratively. Do you have any questions that you would like to add about today's issue? Is there anything you would like to discuss?
No, thank you so much, Doctora. It's really a very great and beneficial presentation. So it would be so great, because sometimes when you correct error and the students, maybe there is a differentiate between error and mistake, but when the teacher corrected the error, it is so beneficial for the student. Thank you so much for this great presentation. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Anything else?
Yeah. Hi. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Arthur.
Sorry, I thought it starts at 15. I didn't know the time changed in Cyprus, actually.
Oh.
We are 1 hour ahead, and I just came right now. I missed the seminar. Is there any chance that you can share the link of the recorded video, something like that?
Well, I don't know. I need to discuss that with the other lecturers and the head of department. So once I've discussed, it's been recorded anyway, so for maybe we can advertise it somewhere for those who have missed it.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, I missed this chance. I really enjoyed. Well, I saw the advertisement in the page of Facebook. I did screenshot of the seminar to remind myself about the time and the date, but unfortunately I couldn't make it.
It doesn't matter. Let's see what I can do and ask let me ask the head of department to see if we can place this somewhere for you all to watch. Thank you for participating, even though it was at the end.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I'm sure that this would be very beneficial actually in your teachings as well, because in our context as you know, students, they don't see errors and corrective feedback as something positive, and maybe we can change this. I don't know, it would have been better if we had more teachers that participated in this seminar, but next time. Thank you for your time and consideration. I'll see you around, I guess. Bye-bye.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Miss.
See you in class, Onurcan and Ayşegül. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
See you, Miss.
Bye.